I wonder if you can just give us a snapshot of the close through the ages.
Yes, it's interesting really, because of course the close that we see now is not what it would have been like in the medieval period, when you would have had large houses for the canons around. And of course the cathedral barn is probably the remnants of one of those. And you would have had a series of these houses, some 12 houses around the close, probably approached with narrow little lanes, rather like the one that goes up by Harley House now, because there wasn't the need for sort of a vast open space. And of course around the cathedral there were thousands and thousands of burials, all with gravestones, some big tombs, and the whole impression of it to any visitor would have been much more like visiting a large churchyard somewhere, rather than this vast open space that we have now. It was only in the 1840s that this was changed. And the other thing that happened, of course, was that as these burials kept going, the ground level started to rise. Every time you put something in, the ground got built up a little bit more, until eventually you were actually having to come up steps from Church Street and from Castle Street, and the ground level against the cathedral was about 2 foot or 3 foot higher than it is now. So the whole feeling would have been totally different. And in the 1840s, the whole thing was lowered. Lots of burials were then disturbed, of course, because most burials weren't the 6 foot deep that you get nowadays. They were quite a lot shallower. And now, of course, with the work that's going on, the burials that were put in before 1840 are very close to the surface, because you've lost that 3 foot of overburden. So as soon as you take the turf up, you immediately find burials. And this is what's been happening over the last 6 months. It's now, 15 years since the Mapamilli building was put up, and before that took place there was obviously the need for an excavation, because the building has a basement underneath the whole setup, which probably people don't appreciate nowadays, but that's where all the rare books, documents and what have you are kept. And the excavation was perhaps a little difficult at times, because it started off, first of all, of course, it was a problem of how much is it going to cost, and how many burials are we likely to find. At that time I was running what is now Archeological Investigations Limited. It was then the City of Hereford Archaeology Committee. And I said, well, basing on what I've seen before, I reckon we're going to hit about 1,000 burials there. Oh, they said, that's far too much. We can't afford that. So they got a rather eminent archaeologist down, whose name I won't mention because it might embarrass him a little, and he said, oh, 200-300 burials at the most, basing it on his experience. Well, we had 1,144 burials, so I think I was a bit nearer than he was. But this created a financial problem in that all the money that had been allocated for the excavation and the work that had to be done on the bones afterwards was spent just on the excavation. So there was no money left to complete the project. And it took the Dean and Chapter several years to get that money together so that the project could continue. And in fact, it's still continuing, because all the bones from that excavation are still at Worcester, where the Worcester Archaeological Unit is putting together a final report. So the 1,000 or so burials that were found there were all processed, first of all in Bradford, where they've got a very important unit for dealing with skeletal material. And then, as I say, Worcester is putting the whole thing together, and it will turn out as probably a 100, 200-page report at the end. So there's still a lot going on there. The other thing, of course, was that we didn't expect during the excavation was that we found a late Saxon cellar, which had been used rather as a cesspit and had a rather splendid sword thrown in the bottom. And then towards one side of the excavation, we had parts of 3 large square pits in which bodies had been flung. And this, of course, was the plague time in Hereford. So we were finding traces of a Saxon road, traces of a Saxon building, a lot of sort of individual burials, and then, of course, the plague pits. So the whole site was quite fascinating. The dig was actually organised directly by the Dean and Chapter, and I basically lent them the staff from the City of Hereford Archaeology Unit. So during the excavation, there was probably 15 or 20 people working. But you've got to imagine this hole as being quite a problem, because you're talking about a hole that's going down 10, 12 feet. So we had to have shoring put in on all sides, great beams across to hold the shoring in place. Everything you could catch your head on was there. And then you had people dealing with individual skeletons and buildings. And the whole excavation probably took about 6 months. And we did have it open to the public quite regularly. So the public had a viewing gallery that they could come along and see what was going on. And I think that's something that's rather missing this time. We could do with that viewing gallery. But hopefully once they get round and they're not in that enclosed area, it will be easier. With most skeletons, it's very unusual to find anything else, except perhaps with the earlier ones, you might find that the head was carefully propped with stones on either side. And with the later ones, although the coffin had totally disappeared, you might find the nails that held the coffin together, rusty nails, which give you the shape of the coffin. Otherwise, there's usually very, very little. You may find an odd pin that held the shroud together. Things like that, the small things, but it's very unusual to find anything else, unless it was perhaps a clergyman who was buried with a chalice or something like that. Of course, there is this problem of why are we so worried about all these burials that are coming up in the close now. And I understand it's now over 1,000 burials. Now, this doesn't mean 1,000 whole skeletons, because as excavations for the various burials are made, they cut through the earlier ones, so you may get, say, just an arm or a leg, but that counts as a skeleton. And several people have said to me already, well, you know, you've had 1,000 already, you've had another 1,000 from the map. How many of these burials do you want, and what's the purpose of it? And I think what they don't realise, that this is probably one of the largest samples that has been excavated anywhere in the country. And because we can work out, with the intercutting, we can work out quite often a rough date for each burial, we can then start looking at the population of Hereford and the surrounding parishes in various periods in history, look at the condition of the bodies, what age they died, what sort of height were they, what sort of illnesses did they have. And we are going to get a tremendous picture of the various periods of the population of Hereford from the Norman conquest on, and possibly earlier. But I would think from the Norman conquest on is more likely, because the earlier burials probably are deeper and we may not hit them. Although I think they've hit some in St John's Quad. So we're going to get that picture of 1,000 years of the population of Hereford, what they were like, perhaps to a certain extent even what they ate. Because, I mean, samples are taken of the soil around and within the burial, if it's in reasonable condition to see whether anything comes out. You might get seeds, nuts, things like that, from whatever their last meal was. The whole picture of Hereford's population is going to come out from this work. Why does it matter? I think one has to be interested in the history of your town. If you're not interested in it, then obviously you think this is rather a waste of time and money, and why don't they just dig them up with a JCB and stick them in a field somewhere else? But I personally think that the history of Hereford, which was at one time one of the most important towns in the country, is tremendously important. And while we can look at buildings, we can excavate the remains of buildings going right back to before the Norman Conquest, we don't have the details of the people who lived there. And this is where we're going to be able to relate the two together, where you can say, this is a typical house of the 12th century, which we've excavated the foundations, we know roughly what it looks like. And we know what sort of people were living there then. So we're getting a full, rounded story. And without this, archaeology can be a bit boring. I think probably one of the biggest changes to the Cathedral Close in the 20th century was when it was decided to open up the view of the cathedral from King Street, because up till that time there had been a row of houses, quite large houses, down the street frontage there, which more or less blocked the view of the cathedral completely. You could say perhaps the close was better enclosed then, because the houses obviously had back fences to them, and there would be a feeling that the traffic wasn't sort of part of the close, and the close was perhaps a quieter place. The earliest picture we have of the houses that were in Broad Street is on a painting by James Wathen about 1800, and this shows one or two which are black and white, and which are a wall going across the front as well. So they were totally different. And these buildings were demolished and replaced in the middle of the 18th century with brand new buildings, one of which was a pub, which eventually became a rooming house. And there were 2 or 3 little shops there, a greengrocer's, a saddler's shop. And when it got to the 1930s, the Dean and Chapter had bought most of these buildings gradually, and they then got a grant of some £3,000 or £4,000 to demolish the buildings and open up the view completely. And this was done tremendously quickly. There's quite a few photographs showing the buildings coming down, and looks a bit hairy by modern health and safety standards. You can see great piles of buildings suddenly collapsing. And the ground was then cleared off. The small amount of railings that were to the south of the buildings were taken down, and a brand new railing was put up all the way along the side there, complete with gates. These didn't last very long because they came down in 1941 as part of the war effort. And of course you can see where the railings were. If you look at the stone plinth, you can see the stubs of the railings all the way along. But of course now we're going to replace the railings. But we are not replacing the gates. This is going to be slightly different. At least it will give more of a sense of enclosure to the close. But by not putting gates on, it will still mean that people feel they can come in there without sort of being locked in or locked out. There's a case used to be in the latter part of the medieval period where the gates were locked to keep the pigs out, because the pigs came in and started rooting amongst the burials.